When the modern person hears the word alchemy, they probably think of some ancient form of chemistry. In fact, possibly the most intelligent man in history, Isaac Newton, was known to tinker in alchemy. So the practice must have been largely scientific, right? Well, not entirely. Let's talk about that here at Miskatonic Lectures. Alchemy came about at a time in history when so-called secret societies were a growing fad. Societies, groups of people who shared similar interests and put their heads together in pursuit of those interests, were just a common thing at the time. Astronomy societies, horse breeding societies, culinary societies, what have you. But secret societies had something to hide, and you usually had to submit to a pretty extensive initiation ritual to join one. Because if you were willing to undergo the ritual, they knew you were committed and could keep their secrets. And alchemy, as a practice, was relegated to private practitioners and secret societies. The most common goal associated with alchemy was trying to get lead to transform into gold. The two metals are relatively soft and heavy, so it may not seem unreasonable to think that they could be closely related, and perhaps a bit of chemical tinkering could get one to transform into the other. However, practitioners of alchemy didn't think of this in terms of chemicals. They had a very philosophical and spiritual approach, inherited largely from Greek thinkers. To the Greeks and the alchemists, metals, trees, buildings, and people all fell along a spectrum from base to precious. The base was the most primitive representation of something, a comically absurd or hideously repulsive version of a thing, as far from perfect as possible. So imagine a child's stick figure drawing of a person, or this picture of a human face from the Miskatonic Art Gallery. These would be base representations of human beings in art form, whereas a master sculptor's work would be precious or perfect representation of a human being. To understand how this works, let's revisit the famous example of Plato's cave. In this well-known parable, a group of men are chained up in a cave, watching shadow puppets on the wall of the cave and thinking these shadows they saw of animals and people actually were animals and people. But no, they were simply poor representations of those things. But one man escapes from the chains, exits the cave, and sees the real world. Now he has seen the perfect representation of humans and animals. Plato would say that there exists some realm of forms. The forms in this realm are the perfected templates of the poor shadows we encounter in the physical world we occupy. But things in our world fall along a spectrum wherein different objects, people, mathematical equations, governments, and acts of virtue are closer and closer to perfection. So whereas lead is a poor, base, disgusting shadow of what a metal should look like, gold is the perfect representation of this metal. But how does one advance metals up the spectrum to approach their perfected form? It was the impression of the alchemists that metals grew within the earth, like an infant grows within its mother's womb. A base metal, like lead, had just not had enough time within the earth to mature. So the question was simply how to get the metal to mature when it left the womb of the earth. A comparable idea to this at this time was the origin of life. For instance, medievalists believed that humans began as homunculus, a microscopic, preformed human who just grew and grew as it sat in the womb. They also believed that vermin like rats, maggots, and roaches sprung up fully formed from filth. They proved this fairly successfully by leaving rotting food covered with filthy rags in a corner, and overnight it was crawling with rats and bugs. It has to be understood that this was not just an idea of physical maturity of homunculi, vermin, and base metals, but of spirituality in maturity as well. Remember, this is drawing from the best form of science they had at the time, ancient philosophy. And by ancient philosophy, the universe was fundamentally spiritual and only superficially material. Scholar James Randi says, beginning about the year 100 and reaching its flower in medieval times, alchemy was an art based partly upon experimentation and partly upon magic. Early investigations of natural processes centered their search on a mythical substance they knew as Philosopher's Stone, which was supposed to possess many valuable attributes such as the power to heal, to prolong life, and to change base metals into precious metal, such as gold. End quote. Now that we know that alchemy was centered on the idea of spiritual maturity, one could see why the so-called Philosopher's Stone could make lead into gold, but also perfect the human body and the human soul. Because ultimately, the process of maturation extended across all of the spiritual and physical world, and the only key was finding the single substance which caused maturity, and you could theoretically transform Earth into a paradise by sprinkling this substance about. It was called a stone, but more commonly thought of as a powder or wax. It was the literal equivalent of transforming Plato's cave into the sunlit world outside. Once discovered, the Philosopher's Stone could turn our imperfect realm of shadows into the Platonic world of forms. Or so the theory goes. The word alchemy is derived from the Egyptian word chem, or gem, which means black, a reference to the black alluvial soil bordering the Nile. And the Greek word chyma means to fuse or cast metals. This was later established in the Arabic as alchemia. In fact, it was the Arabian word which first picked up where the Greeks left off in the practicing of alchemy and translating the Greek texts into Arabic. Only later on did the Europeans take up the practice. So the history of alchemy practice ranges almost as broadly as the practice of astrology. And just as astronomy eventually emerged from astrology, chemistry eventually emerged from alchemy. But how did these ancient alchemists believe that such transformations could be done? In modern chemistry, we know that the various elements are made up of atoms which contain different configurations of protons, electrons, and neutrons. Since we can't get into an atom with tweezers and fiddle around with these various particles, if we wanted to turn lead into gold, we would need the much more complex and expensive technique of a particle accelerator, which uses magnets to push individual particles around, speeding them up faster and faster until we slam them into each other and create new configurations. So we can manufacture gold, but we can only do it one atom at a time, and it costs a lot of money in terms of the raw power it takes to run the accelerator each time we do it. In the ancient world, they had a different idea of how elements were made. This ancient world put a great deal of consideration into the idea of balance. If the world was balanced, it was perfect. But if things fell out of balance, they began to decline. They believed, for instance, that humans were composed of 4 humors, which included phlegm, blood, black bile, and yellow bile. So long as the humors were in balance, the person was healthy. But if they came out of balance, the human became ill. So once a person was ill, they began to extract whatever humors they could in order to bring balance back to the person and restore health. In the same way, alchemists felt that the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, had to be in perfect balance in order to perfect an element. So a great deal of alchemy simply involved fiddling around with dirt, billows, forges, and buckets to determine the correct balance. Because the alchemists frequently had higher aims than simply getting wealthy, that is, they wanted to achieve physical and spiritual perfection, in many ways the pieces of lead was an experimental item which could help them to determine if their attempt at creating the Philosopher's Stone had worked. So what do we know about the element formation that the ancient alchemists did not? Well, as mentioned before, elements are composed of a number of electrons, protons, and sometimes neutrons. The general rule is, the less components in an element, the more of it we can find. So the simplest and most abundant element in the universe is hydrogen, which contains exactly one electron and one proton. Indeed, at one point, hydrogen was likely the only element in the universe, which raises the question where everything else came from. The simple answer to that is stars. Stars form when a massive amount of hydrogen is drawn together by its collective gravity, causing tremendous amounts of pressure to build. As the pressure builds, the hydrogen atoms begin to move about faster and faster, until they begin to collide into one another, at the sorts of speeds we would need a supercollider to reproduce. As they slam together, they begin to combine in a process called fusion. The atoms fuse together, and a tremendous amount of energy is released as a result, which is what gives a star its heat and light. For the first part of its life, stars combine hydrogen molecules and produce helium, as a result, which has 2 protons and 2 electrons, essentially the product of 2 hydrogen atoms fused together. So what? A star can take the simplest element and create the next most simple element. Not much of interest there. However, stars live for a very long time, and during that time the nuclear reactor at the center of the star starts to run out of hydrogen, as it eventually fuses it all. When that happens, the star changes shape and size and begins to fuse the only element it has to fuse, helium. As the star fuses helium, it produces carbon and oxygen. When it runs out of helium, it has to start fusing the next elements, and so on up the periodic table. When the star explodes, it spreads its guts all over the cosmos, which contain most of the elements in the periodic table, so that when a planet like Earth eventually forms, from all the dust and wreckage of the previous star, we have some of everything to go around. Interestingly, the really complex heavy elements like lead and gold are hard to get from the life cycle of a star. These are thought to be produced when neutron stars or even black holes collide, because only the massive amounts of energy and pressure produced by such a cosmic collision are sufficient to produce such heavy elements. Or so the theory goes. Since you may imagine that cosmic events like that occur fairly infrequently, it is a wonder that we have everything on the periodic table present here on Earth. In fact, few, if any, other planets in the solar system are as abundant with elements as is Earth. Knowing what we do know about elements, we can turn up our noses at the simpletons of the past and their quaint ideas regarding earth, air, fire, and water as the basic elements. But that wasn't all there was to alchemy. What about the idea that there are perfect platonic forms and imperfect ones? Surely some human beings follow a genetic and physical template which is superior to others, right? I mean, surely Joseph Merrick wasn't quite as ideal a form as, say, a young Arnold Schwarzenegger. Or, in terms of character and quality, surely Martin Luther King Jr. or an Abraham Lincoln were superior to characters like, say, Hitler or Stalin. Or even in the world of elements, surely gold is indeed superior to lead, no matter how they are formed. Gold does not corrode, it is an excellent conductor, it is aesthetically pleasing, whereas lead is literally toxic, a poor construction material, and has no luster or sheen. Perhaps things do not develop along a spectrum as alchemists thought, but perhaps there does exist an ideal spectrum of quality along which things lie. Let's see how Lovecraft's philosophy of cosmicism would answer Plato's philosophy of forms. There is at least one way in which Plato and Lovecraft would agree: human ignorance. Whereas Plato saw the masses of humans as being unenlightened cave dwellers, and the perfect man, the philosopher, as being enlightened and aware of the perfect world of forms, Lovecraft's view was sort of the bizarro world version of Plato. Under Lovecraft, yes, humans dwell in ignorance. However, ignorance is our safe space. We thrive and we flourish in ignorance. Were a human to be set free from Lovecraft's cave and venture out into the world beyond, he would not return an enlightened man, ready to free other cave dwellers. He would return a madman, and either seek to chain himself up again and forget the horrors beyond the cave, or simply end himself. How does this relate to alchemy? Put quite simply, the terms of quality we just discussed between the deformed man and a physically fit man, or a toxic dull metal and a useful beautiful metal, that spectrum of quality is an illusion of the human mind. It keeps us occupied in our island of ignorance in the universe, and so is useful that way. But the scales of quality, reason, and morality we have developed here on Earth are meaningless and insanity-inducing in the cosmos. And the alchemist is just as correct as the chemist, because they are both equally ignorant of the incomprehensible universe beyond us. When one discusses alchemy in the context of Lovecraft, it would be criminal not to mention Lovecraft's first ever published work, a simple story titled The Alchemist. In this story, the titular alchemist was just a wizard or sorcerer, definitely highlighting the magical rather than scientific side of alchemy. This character is killed, and his son places a curse on the family responsible for killing his father. And thereafter, every male member in the lineage meets a tragic death on his 32nd birthday. The story is told by some ancestor, 100 years down the line, whose 32nd birthday is approaching. He hides out in the family castle and seeks to protect himself from the curse. One thing leads to another, and he eventually discovers that the man who had placed the curse on the family had discovered the Philosopher's Stone, obtained immortality, and had personally been responsible for killing each of the family members over the last 100 years. This contains one definite allusion to alchemy, that the ultimate goal, the Philosopher's Stone, was supposed to grant immortality. But it was also supposed to grant personal and spiritual perfection. So if we're following the basic rules of alchemy here, the same substance that kept the wizard immortal would have turned him into an exemplary human and not a trollish fiend living beneath the castle and killing someone every 32 years. But again, on cosmicism, good and evil, perfection and flaws are illusions of the human mind, and do not reflect some attribute ingrained in larger cosmos. I've been Joel Furchess for Miskatonic University.